This is one of those little plastic eggs, and it was in my box at the church. Well, I like plastic eggs, especially if there's candy inside. And I thought, this is going to be good. I'm going to get my chocolate fix here in a minute. Or maybe there's a little gift or a little note saying that I'm being appreciated. I mean, surely it's going to be something good. So I opened it up. And here's what it said. Mr. Kevin, here's an egg just for you. It's empty, like Jesus' tomb. So thank you, Libby, England, for giving me a gift that was empty. And thank God the tomb was empty. And I don't want our life to be empty. So over the next 6 weeks, we're going to have a series called Relevant to Who? Who is your life relevant to? I think about my life, and I've been reflecting over it, and I'm going to continue to reflect over the next few weeks. And I think about self-identity. How do you get your self-identity? Is it based on what others think about you? Is it based on seeking approval from others? Is it based on accomplishment and performance? Or is your self-identity more relevant to God? And do you get it from a deep love relationship with your Creator? What about worship? I think about worship, and oftentimes people tell me, well, I just want my worship to be pleasing to God. It's not unusual in a lot of churches to hear, well, God, I hope that what we did today was pleasing to you. But when I dig into people's lives and talk to people about worship and what they wish was happening in worship, I find out that more often than not, people are interested in a worship that is relevant to their own preferences rather than relevant to what God is really looking for. And that goes across the board, young or old. People are interested in a worship that's relevant to themselves rather than relevant to God. What about your prayer life? It's another thing that I've been sort of struggling with. Is your prayer life a two-way conversation that's relevant to yourself and God, or is it all relevant only to yourself? My requests, my needs, my hurts, my supplications, or are you actually having a conversation with God where you listen when God speaks? What sort of life are we living? In Galatians chapter 2, verse 20, Paul says, I've been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me, and the life I now live in the body, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. So the life that we're living is not supposed to be our own anymore. It's supposed to be a life that's relevant to the life of Christ in us. Are we living the life of Christ or living our own life and hoping that Christ is in a part of it? In Ephesians chapter 4, verse 22 through 23, he says, you were taught with regard to your former way of life to put off your old self, which is being corrupted by its deceitful desires, to be made new in the attitude of your minds. Somehow when we live a life that's relevant to God, our mind is transformed, our life is transformed, the purpose of our life changes. The question is, are we listening and tuning in to God's will for our life? So Franklin D Roosevelt, it is said, was bored with all the receptions at the White House. All these people coming with these fake smiles and superficial greetings. So at one of the receptions, just to play a game and test how well people listened, he decided to greet them with the following. Hello, I killed my grandmother this morning. And to his great surprise, people said, well, I'm having a great day. I hope you're having one too. And they just kept coming on by. Finally, a foreign diplomat came by and he said, I killed my grandmother this morning. And he said, well, I'm sure she had it coming. So at least he listened. At least he listened. But you know, are we listening to God in our life? Because you can't lead a life relevant to God if you're not listening. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the story of Henry Nouwen. Some of the thoughts I'll be sharing over the next few weeks were inspired by his little book called In the Name of Jesus. And if you haven't ever read it, it's an easy read. You can read it probably in a couple hours, and it was very convicting to me. I read it years ago. I'm still reading it. because it keeps reminding me of what's most important in my life. But Henry was a theologian, and he taught Christian psychology, Christian theology, and Christian spirituality. And he was teaching at well-known universities, and the last university he taught at was Harvard. But when he examined his life, he decided, I'm not sure that I'm living my life the way that God wants me to live my life. I'm worried that my soul is in danger. And he started looking at his life, very famous theologian, in demand, speaking at other institutions and universities. And he looked deeply at his life to try and figure out what he should do. And when he looked at his life, he said, well, I found that I was deficient in the following areas. First of all, I was praying poorly. And my prayers were rote, and I didn't feel deeply connected to God, and I felt that spiritually I was impoverished. And then I continued to look at my life, and not only was I praying poorly, but I was driven by urgent things in life. It was from calendar event to calendar event, and task to task, and appointment to appointment, and deadline to deadline. And there wasn't time in my life to stop and even listen to God. It was like I wasn't in control of my life, someone else, and it wasn't God. And then thirdly, he decided, as he was looking at his life, he said, I was living in isolation. I wasn't living in community. I was successful. My friends were telling me I was successful, but I was lonely. In Matthew chapter 16, verse 18, Jesus says to Peter, I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. And we know that the word church is ekklesia in the Greek, and it means a gathering or assembly. The root meanings of the two different words are called out. So it's a group of people called out to be a community of people. Jesus didn't just die to help you get to heaven. Jesus had something even grander in mind. He had in mind that we begin to live the life of God here. It's the first fruits of the Spirit that we already experience here on earth, and it can only be experienced in community. God lives in community, the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, and we're expected to live in community. And I want you to think about this. Community is where we learn to love. It's where we learn to be loved. It's where we're challenged. It's where we're held accountable. Community is where we learn humility. Community is where we get the support that we need when we're hurting. We get it in community. Community is where God expects us to welcome the strangers, and part of God's nature is that you're always welcoming and reaching out to the stranger, and you bring them into community. Community is also the place where I think you can hear God best. When you're in community with God's people, it opens up your heart so you can hear God better. That's why in 1 John 4, John says that if you can't love your brother who you can see, how can you expect to love God who you can't see? And if you can't love your brother and you only do that in community, and if you can't love God, how can you hear from God? So Henry began praying about what God might be calling him to do. He was attempting to tune in to God. And as he prayed to God, Henry felt that God clearly told him, Henry, I want you to go and live with the poor, and I'll heal you. Now, I was sharing this story with my mother about Henry Nouwen, and I said, Mom, Henry said that he heard this clear message from God that he was supposed to go live with the poor and that he would heal them. And I started to explain to her some of the consequences of that. And she said, now hang on, did you say that he heard from God that he was supposed to go live with the poor and then God would heal him? I said, yeah, that's what I said. Well, I may have missed a part. How did God tell him that? And I didn't know what to say. I said, well, Mom, he probably got an email, right? And so what I want to know is, how does God talk to us? How do you hear from God? In Acts chapter 16, we have the story of Paul, and he tried to go into Asia, And it says that the Spirit of Jesus prevented him. So he tried to go into Bithynia, and the Spirit of Jesus prevented him. And so as he was passing Mysia, and he went down to Troas, and during the night, it says that he had a vision of a man from Macedonia standing and begging him, come over to Macedonia and help us. And Paul then knew what to do. Now, I want to know, how do you hear from God? I'll admit it, I haven't received any emails. So it makes it more difficult sometimes to know, but I firmly and truthfully believe that God will speak to you if you can learn to listen. It's a spiritual listening. It's a spiritual communication. And I think that I remember one time teaching an auditorium class, and I was teaching to all the people that were over 60, and I thought they were really old, and now I'm one of them. And I remember thinking, well, these people probably think God only speaks through the Word, and they're probably really conservative. And I said, have any of you felt like God told you something to do before? And I was amazed at how many hands came up. And some older lady that was about 78 or 80 stood up and just blew my mind with the way she felt she had followed the calling of God in her life. We don't talk about it enough. But when we walk in faith, God tells us what to do. And so he went to live with the poor, and he had an invitation to go to a community called La Arche, and they're all over the world, these communities, and they're for adults with multiple disabilities. And he said, this was really a tough experience for me. I went from teaching the best and the brightest of the young people of our world that want to rule the world, and I went to this place where we had adults whose bodies had broken minds. And they didn't care that I was intelligent. They didn't want to hear my theological theories. They didn't want to hear any of my philosophy or Christian spirituality. They just wanted to know if I was going to show them that I loved them. And he said, I had been in a situation where I was successful, and for 20 years I had this freedom to go where I wanted and decide where I was going to speak, and I could just leave and go at any time because I was fairly disconnected from people. But at this community, he said, I made a commitment to be in this community, and I agreed not to leave without their permission, and they put together a group to help him decide which speaking appointments he could accept so he wasn't gone all the time. And one of the clients, or one of the adults with multiple disabilities, was on that group with him to speak for them because they wanted him to live with them. And he said, I didn't have the freedom that I used to have to do what I wanted to do. And yet, you know what? He started to calm down spiritually. He started to hear God, and he said, God healed him. God healed him. In James chapter 1, verse 27, it says that religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this, to look after orphans and widows in their distress. This is pure religion. He was practicing pure religion. Should we be surprised that he was healed? Why is it that when we go on mission trips, or we go to third world countries, we come back with this sort of spiritual awakening and spiritual purity because we realize that God's Spirit works everywhere, and sometimes he seems to work better in the hearts of the poor than he does the rich? Why is it that we go to Mexico or Guatemala or Panama and we see people that have nothing and they're smiling in bigger ways than we are? Because happiness and true contentment comes from God, not from wealth or anything that we do. And so the question that we have to ask ourselves, and I want us to grapple with over the next few weeks, is, are we really listening to God? Are we hearing God? Because when we listen to God, his Spirit will stir us up. He'll move us somewhere. He'll challenge us. We'll have to get out of our comfort zone. We'll have to do something that maybe in our selfish, fleshly self we wouldn't want to do. But when we do it, he'll bless us. That's what the Spirit will call us to do. In James 4:13 through 14, he says, now listen, you who say today or tomorrow we'll go to this city and spend a year there and carry on business and make money. Why, you do not even know what will happen tomorrow. What is your life? You're a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. Life is short. I was sitting in Stephen's class this morning on finances over in the Fellowship Center, and he was talking about how if you just save a little bit of money when you're young, even a little bit, I think he was talking about $35 a week for 35 years, and it came up to $330 or $40 or $50,000, something like that, with interest. And so you get to the end of your life, and you don't have money, and you know what? You kind of regret that you didn't save $35 a week. Or to use his illustration, the guy that's spending $35 a week on the lottery is going to regret it, because that's not a very good retirement plan. But when you get towards the end of your life, and you never know when that's going to come, I don't want us to be filled with regrets. And one of the things that happens when we get towards the end of our life, don't we think back about how we could have been better parents as our kids leave? Don't we think back about how we wish we had saved a little more? Don't we think back, and I hope, wish how we had invested more into the kingdom? Because investing into the kingdom is the only investment that lasts through eternity. And if we're counting on our earthly riches, we're going to find out that the end of our life, it's going to be empty. You don't get to take any of it with you. I was talking to a close friend this past weekend who, has, by my standards, a lot of money. And it's interesting talking to this close friend. They're trying to live off the interest, and they're having a hard time living off the interest. And I'm thinking, well, forget it. Just live off the principal. That's what I do if I had that much money. And it'll outlast your life. So it's all relative, right? But they decided to bless a couple people with gifts, and they told me, because I realized I can't take it with me. And when I get up there, I don't want to be empty. And so the question that we have to ask ourselves is, that I want us to ask ourselves, what decisions have I been making lately, and how are they a reflection of the way that I'm listening to God? What decisions have I been making lately, and how are they a reflection of the way that I'm listening to God? James Hamilton, in his book Directions, tells a story of a gentleman that lost his watch, an old-fashioned wind-up watch, in an ice house. So I didn't realize there were ice houses, but I should have been smart enough to know that. I found out about it about a year ago when I visited George Washington's home in Mount Vernon and got to see their ice house. And what they would do, since they didn't have refrigerators, is they go down to the river when it froze over and cut out big blocks of ice, take it to the ice house and cover it with sawdust and put it in a basement somewhere and lock the door. And sometimes those big blocks of ice would last through the summer. That's how they had ice. And so they were bringing all this ice into this ice house, and the gentleman's watch must have fallen off, and he couldn't find it. And he had everybody come in and help me look, and they looked, and they swept through that sawdust. They never could find it. And then some young boy heard about it and said, I think I can find it. And so he went and slipped into that ice house when nobody was there, and he emerged a few moments later with the watch. And they were curious. We looked everywhere. How did you find that watch? And he said, well, I went and laid down in the sawdust, and no one was in there, and it was really quiet, and I heard it ticking. Pretty smart. What does it take to hear from God? We need to make sure that we listen for the will of God in our life, because God is a God of the present, and he'll speak to those who are silent enough to hear what he's saying. We have to live in the moment enough to know what God is calling us to do. We're not going to find them in our calendar. I'm not saying don't keep a calendar, but you're going to find God in the realm of reality and the realm of life, because God is a living God who interacts and talks to us. We need to learn to listen to God. And I want us to know this, that God has a plan for you in his kingdom. Your life isn't just yours to live. And if you think it's just yours to live, you're going to find out it's going to end up empty somewhere down the road, and you're going to regret the way you lived your life. It's not your life. And so you need to trust God enough to know that He has a reason or a purpose for you in His kingdom. You need to trust Him that much and be willing to listen and be bold enough to seize or follow or move or do whatever you need to do to fulfill the calling, to answer the calling that God puts on your life. That's what we all need to do. So as you go through this next week, my challenge for you is to listen to God in ways you haven't listened before. And I'm going to be honest with you. I've been trying to do it this week, and sometimes it's been frustrating because I'm listening and I don't feel like I'm hearing anything. And I'm thinking, well, shoot, I have to get up Sunday morning and preach, God. Come on. I need something. So I'm not saying it's always easy, but it is necessary. If we're going to please God, it is necessary. So I want you to listen to God this week. You know what I'd love to hear? If anybody hears from God this week, email me. I'd love to hear about it. Email me and tell me what God said to you this week. Let's do this as a community this week. Let's listen to God. Let's share it with each other. Let's encourage each other with what God's telling us. And if we haven't heard from Him, let's confess to each other. I didn't hear this week, but hopefully I'll hear something next week. It's a lifelong process, a lifelong project, and it's one that is the most important project we'll ever embark on. So as we go into this week, let's tune into God and find out what God is saying to you. If you're here today and you haven't been hearing God and you want to open up your heart and we can help you by praying for you, or you don't feel like you have a relationship with God and you want to know how to begin that relationship with God, we would love to visit with you. We'll have elders that are here at the front or here at the back if that's more comfortable for you. We'll invite you to come while we stand and while we sing.